and it gives me great pleasure as chairman of the Irish Skin Foundation to welcome you here this evening and to tell you something of the past and also to look a little towards the future. I'm going to begin our story back in the Georgian era. At least I hope I'm going to begin our story. Yes, on the Georgian era in St. Stephen's Green, which is the location in which we are gathered here this evening. It was a slightly different place in the Georgian period, a bit more tranquil perhaps. But here we found there was an interesting person called Gustavus Hume. And Gustavus Hume was a surgeon. In fact, he was president of the Royal College of Surgeons. But I think looking back on it, he had very little interest in surgery. His main interest was building houses. And so he built houses in Frederick Street, Hume Street, Ely Place, and he was really remarkably good at building houses. He was also remarkably good at having children. He had 21 of them. And there was a little verse at the time which said, Gustavus Hume in surgery excels, but pride of place ne'er his bosom swells. He gives to Dublin every year a street where citizens converse and friendly meet. And so he gave us houses like Ely House, which you all know, and indeed where we used to hold our annual general meetings after the hospital had closed. And this house had very interesting occupants. In the early period, the Earl of Ely, for whom the house was built, he's seen here with his wife and with the artist Angelica Kaufmann, and a very interesting woman with the remarkable name of Dolly Munro. And Dolly Munro apparently was one of the beauties of the time and was much sought after, but seems to have retained her reputation and perhaps her virtue. Sir William Thornley Stoker bought Ely House and lived there. He was the brother of Bram Stoker. He was another surgeon, and he was quite an interesting character in many ways, but his biggest interest was in purchasing good furniture. And in fact, Gogarty said of him, the Uppison carpet in the drawing room represents a hernia, the Ming enamel a floating kidney, the Buhl cabinet his opinion of an enlarged liver, the Renaissance bronze on the landing a set of gallstones. We also had, living just across the road, George Augustus Moore. Moore, of course, was a very interesting figure. He was a subject, the delight, people said, of caricaturists, but other painters painted him, like Manet here. And Moore wrote some beautiful books. When he left Dublin, he wrote Hail and Farewell, which became very popular because half the city bought it to see if they were in it and the other half to see if they weren't in it. But Moore is perhaps best known for his recent revival in the film Albert Nobbs with Glenn Close, and I would add that the script for this was written by John Banville. There's another interesting house, 18 Ely Place, which is where this gallery now stands. This was a beautiful house that was demolished, and indeed it was in the days before there was an appreciation of Dublin's architecture. I don't think it would be demolished today, and we mightn't have this gathering here in this gallery if that was the case. But this house was occupied by Oliver St. John Gogarty, and this is his portrait by William Orpin. Now, Gogarty was an interesting figure, very talented writer, poet. He was a senator, and he was also an ENT surgeon. A lot of medical people around the area. He held regular garden parties, and this slide here shows a massive collection of intellect at one of his garden parties. And while you're looking at that and reading the names, I'll tell you a little story about Gogarty. It was his practice every evening after he'd finished seeing his patients in his rooms to walk down for a drink to the Lincoln, what is now the Lincoln Bar, but in those days was known as Senator Fannigan's Pub in Lincoln Place. And at that time, there was an electric sign over Fannigan's Pub with the letters OXO, and that vied with the Bovril sign in Nassau Street. But on one particular day in the 40s, the Eoin Oxo went out of order, and there weren't many electricians in the city, but one named Joe, who was well known, was called to fix the broken sign. And he came along in the morning. He had a few pints downstairs, which was to be his undoing, because when he went up on the roof to fix the sign, he slipped and fell to his death. And that evening there was understandably an air of gloom in the senator's pub. And when Gogarty arrived in to meet the other literati who were assembled, Senator Flanagan handed him a brown paper bag and said, "Would you write a few words to poor Joe? You heard what happened to him this morning." And Gogarty wrote the following: "Here is my ode to Engineer Joe, who fell to his death through the O in Oxo. He's gone to a land which is far, far better. He went, as he came, through a hole in a letter." Other things were to happen in Hume Street, slightly more notorious. And in the 50s, we had the case of Mary Ann Cadden, who performed an abortion, and the unfortunate lady on whom the operation was being conducted died. And Mamie Cadden, as she was known, was sentenced to death, and later this was commuted to life imprisonment, and she died in Dundrum Asylum. Interestingly, in this day when we're talking about abortion, there are sort of books that say that perhaps she wasn't the evil person that society portrayed her to be, but she may have been providing a service that was much needed. And then in the 60s, we had the Battle of Hume Street, where the preservation of the Georgian houses was fought for and lost. But it was an awakening to the people of the city that our architecture was something that should be preserved and looked after. And it's timely indeed to look at the disgraceful state of Hume Street Hospital and the lack of maintenance that NAMA give to any of their properties. And there is indeed a website trying to protect the hospital buildings, which we all look at with great sadness. And that brings me on now to the City of Dublin Skin and Cancer, known more affectionately as Hume Street Hospital. This hospital began in a rather modest way, and this is a photograph showing the gathering of people who were founding the hospital. And here we have in the centre the first matron of the hospital, Betty Charles, and then standing close to her, her sister, and behind her, Andrew Charles, who was the real founder of the hospital. And I think it's a very interesting photograph because it starts, if you like, what was to be prominent in the hospital's history, fundraising. The hospital never had a positive balance sheet at any stage in its existence, and they were always looking for money. Andrew Charles was a surgeon, but he had more than an interest in surgery. His main interest was cancer, and he bought 2 houses. We don't have early pictures of those houses, but this is what they became a little later in life. And it was here that he set up Hume Street Hospital for the treatment of diseases of skin and cancer. He went on then, that was in 1911, and in 1916 he obtained a charter. And it was interesting because this was the last charter to be granted to the voluntary hospital movement in this city. He founded the first journal of cancer and was an expert on cancer, and it is very interesting to read his articles and his approach to the treatment of cancer. He bought the most modern equipment that he could find to treat cancer and to treat skin disease. And this is an interesting quote. "The X-ray department of the hospital was one of the largest and best equipped in the British Isles. At present they were desirous of spending about 3,000, again, which they had not got, in equipping a radium department. 1 gram of radium cost 12,000, and he believed that there were only 50 grams in the world. About 12 milligrams for cancer of the tongue, 70 for cancer of the brain, and 140 for cancer of the breast, a milligram costing £11.10. So he and his colleagues and the supporting board of the hospital set out to raise funds, and every year there were features like this. This is the Rose of Persia by Gilbert Sullivan, and these events were very avidly attended. Gogarty raises his presence again in that he was an implacable enemy of the hospital. And this, I think, was based on the fact that he and Andrew Charles, for whatever reason, did not like or admire each other. Now, it's fair to say that whereas Gogarty was a wit and a writer and a poet and a senator and all of those things, he was very acerbic and very uncharitable in many of his statements. But for whatever reason, as senator, he was able to deny the hospital getting any of the largesse from the much disputed sweepstake. Nonetheless, the hospital thrived, and these figures show that it goes from strength to strength. As you can see, the number of patients between 1934 and 1939 increased quite dramatically. So things were going well in spite of the lack of money. And then, calamity of calamities, Andrew Charles died at the early age of 54 in 1933. And I think the hospital was in a state of absolute shock because it depended on his energy and drive really to keep the hospital going. But the board got together and decided that they would have to face this, and they appointed a number of people and apportioned the many duties that Andrew Charles was performing. First of all, his son, Havelock Charles, was appointed to administer the hospital and to look after the skin department. And my father, just back from the RAF, was appointed as visiting physician, and he had fallen in love with my mother, who was an intern in Mercer's hospital at the time. And whether to enhance the amorous relationship or not, it was proposed by Dr. O'Donnell and seconded by Mr. Cooligan that Dr. Muriel Smitty be appointed as house surgeon. The board did not like this. Having been informed yesterday by Dr. Charles of the recommendation, they said that it was not suitable for a lady house surgeon to be appointed to the hospital. The medical staff prevailed nonetheless, and Dr. Muriel Smitty, my mother, was appointed to the hospital, and some years later, this is a photograph of me and my father. I don't think there's any substance in the rumour that I was conceived in the hospital, but who knows. And then there was a very important appointment in 1938 when Joan O'Sullivan was appointed as matron to the hospital. And she really was a very remarkable woman. And she was, I think, the dominant figure in the hospital for the next 30 years. Michael Brady, or Mick Brady as he was known, is seen here on this side. And in between him and my father is Noel Brown, who was the Minister for Health. And this photograph was taken at the Biological Society and the College of Surgeons in the year that my father was president. And there was great annoyance from Brady and my father that Brown, instead of talking to the topic of the evening, had chosen to use the occasion as a political platform to propagate whatever the political message of the time was. MacAuliffe Curtin was appointed as the ENT surgeon. He's seen here in later years when he was president of the College of Surgeons with the then president of the country, Carol O'Dawley. Alan Mooney was appointed as ophthalmologist, and he succeeded his father, and indeed his son succeeded him. So we had 3 generations of ophthalmologists in the hospital. And then there was Tommy Gilmartin, who was appointed as anaesthetist to the hospital. He's seen here standing in front of the portrait of his wife, Peggy Gilmartin, who gave a lot of time and effort to the hospital and the Ladies' Guild. And yet these were poor times. There was very little money around in the post-war period, and as you can see from this, the public were urged to help the hospital in ways that we would find very strange now. And yet, the equipping of the hospital went on, and it kept itself up to date in many respects of aspects of treatment. The wards were bright and clean and airy, and the nursing staff were always very dedicated under the matron Joan O'Sullivan. And the outpatients department flourished. And I rather like the little touch here that Wednesday evening, 7 to 8:30 p.m., to facilitate treatment of those who are occupied during the day. I don't think we'd find our present health service catering for that sort of eventuality. The hospital also expanded. It acquired the remaining properties on Hume Street and also 2 properties on Ely Place. A very successful nursing home was opened, and I remember this well. My grandmother died there, my father-in-law died there, and my father died there. And it was a place where people were looked after with extreme kindness, again under Joan O'Sullivan's careful watch. And it is interesting that her sister Tessa O'Sullivan also ran Portobello Nursing Home, which was a very successful private nursing home up at Portobello Bridge. The hospital was more like a family than a hospital, and there were gatherings with all the staff. I rather like this one because I remember, as Tona will, Winnie used to serve sandwiches in the matron's office every afternoon with tea, and she used to trudge this up from the basement, and she was really a lovely person. And then we have Iris Charles here, who is the wife of Hal Charles, and various other people. The Fixer Burke, yes, he was known, the politician, and so it goes on. All sorts of people were gathered. There was a concert every year which was held in the wards, and of course there was the annual dance where people, the staff and others, gathered in rather strange surroundings. I don't quite know what the pipe is in the background, but anyway, there it is. And I must make mention of the Ladies' Guild, because it was a remarkable gathering of the wives of members of the staff at the hospital. And this guild met frequently, and they ran various fundraising functions. And were it not for the Ladies' Guild, there's no doubt about it, the hospital would not have survived. And again, that's Peggy Gilmartin, that's my mother there. And this was the secretary of the hospital who brought some shame on the hospital when he embezzled a certain amount of money, but we won't go into that today. And then Nell Sheridan was the radiographer, a remarkable woman whose personality dominated the hospital. And the young man standing beside her smoking a cigarette is the speaker. And it was she who taught me to use the electrocardiograph, and it may well be that she stimulated my interest in cardiology, but she certainly taught me a lot. And then there were the Board of Governors of this period. Philip Walker was undoubtedly the most dynamic and driving of these people. Philip and I became very good friends, and I respected him greatly. He was the first president, in fact, of the hospital when that post was created. And it was he who brought me on to the staff of the hospital. This is an early photograph of a group of us. And he also brought various interesting people to talk at the annual general meeting. He brought across Eamon Andrews, and Andrews said what I think one could say at the hospital at any time, but he said it with such conviction. Proposing this resolution is like proposing that we stay alive as long as we can, that we should have sunrise tomorrow, that the cause of peace should have our support. In other words, we don't have a choice. I am stating the obvious. Not only is Hume Street Hospital worthy of our support, it has a right to that support. And then, rather like with the death of Andrew Charles, Joan O'Sullivan died suddenly on duty in her office. It was a great shock to us all at the time, and the hospital was shaken once more very, very badly. But others came along, and Maeve Dwyer, pictured here with her compatriot, her warrior in arms, I might call her, the young dermatologist, Sarah Rogers, is seen here. And so the ship was steadied. And then the Board of Governors. There was a remarkable, I would call it almost benign or benevolent nepotism in the hospital, because here we see Fergal Quinn, when the days of Red Island with his father, who had been chairman of the board, and they were both chairman of the board. The Lovegrove dynasty started with Fred Lovegrove and passed on to his son Jim Lovegrove. And here we see Gearóid with Seamus Kennedy. And I want to acknowledge Seamus's role in the latter days of the hospital, where he was remarkable assistance to Matt O'Brien and to others in those difficult days. And he continues, indeed, to be a remarkable assistant to the hospital, to the charity. So now, out of this hospital came the Charles Institute and the Charles Centre. And how did this exactly happen? Well, it happened because the hospital simply became unfit for purpose. And in 2006, it went on the market. There was great nostalgia about that at the time. I remember many people saying, we can't close this hospital, it has to continue. But then there were those of us who were realistic about it and said, it cannot continue. You couldn't have wooden staircases, for example, because of the fire threat. And so the hospital had to close. And it was a big property, an attractive property right in the centre of the city. And 2006 might be deemed the eve of the recession. And so the hospital sold, and sold for a very substantial amount of money. It was in that year that I wrote to the then chairman, Matt O'Brien. I won't ask you to read the letter, but I'll just read two things from it. And I said to him, the board of management might consider endowing a dermatological centre of excellence, perhaps in St. Vincent's University Hospital, with part of the proceeds from the sale of the hospital premises. Such a unit should be named appropriately and perpetuate the ethos of the original hospital in Hume Street. The board of management would be administered from the centre and would hold the memorabilia from the Hume Street Hospital in such a centre. Now, those words were, I think, rather profound, even though I say so myself, but they would have been of no substance, or they would have had no relevance unless they fell on fertile soil, as it were. And two people I single out as being absolutely essential to what happened subsequently. The first is Matt O'Brien, who was chairman of the board in that period. And Matt took this message very, very seriously, and he and I and Peter and other members of the board, we went off and we visited Trinity and we visited UCD and we listened to the College of Surgeons. And then the second person came on the scene, and that was Des Fitzgerald, the Vice President of Research for Research in UCD. He apologises for not being here this evening as he's on business in Amsterdam. So it was Matt and Des who between them took this idea and made something very important happen. The Charles Institute was conceived, and the first board met in 2009. And then there was the launch of the Charles Institute. And here we have Dame Beulah Bewley, who is the niece of Andrew Charles, and Norma Futers, who is the granddaughter, with Paul Collins and Mary Harney, who was the then Minister for Health at the launch of the Institute. And in a space of some 5 years, the Charles Institute moved from being a concept to being a reality, which I think by any standards is a remarkable achievement. And this wonderful building, which looks rather like the prow of a ship, I think will be the prow of not just Irish dermatology, but national dermatology in the years to come. The first meeting of the charity, as the board of the old hospital was now called, met in the Charles Institute on the 10th of March in 2011. The joke must have been good. I can't remember what it was, but everybody seemed to be very happy with whatever it was. And then we had the first meeting, as I say, of the charity. And it's interesting to look at the charity board, or the old Hume Street Hospital board as it would have been, because there are now 4 women on the board, something that was banned in the days of yore. And the charter had to be modified to accommodate this very, very important step. The Child's Institute looks well from the outside, but it's also been very carefully furbished on the inside. And here we see the Kevin Barry window, which had been in Earlsfort Terrace in UCD and has now made its way out to the Child's Institute, and a very beautiful piece of art it is. And here we see Brian O'Doherty, perhaps one of the least known artists in Ireland, but internationally a figure of amazing relevance. And Brian set up one of his famous rope drawings here, the arrow of curiosity, the curve of conciliation, and the line of inquiry. And then the opening of the Child's Institute in September 2011 was a wonderful occasion, and many events have taken place. I'll refer to one, and that was the launch of the history of the hospital. And this is Bobby Balla and Hugh Brady, the president, and of course Des Fitzgerald. And it's appropriate that Bobby Balla should design our logo of the Irish Skin Foundation. And if I can indulge myself for a brief moment by showing a family photograph, and I remind the youngest member of the family that the benevolent nepotism that existed in Hume Street Hospital will not exist in his generation. There was another very important step that the Child's Institute had to take, and that was to appoint a director to oversee the early years, the formation of the Child's Institute, so that it can become and will become an international centre of excellence. And Frank Powell, seen here at the European Academy of Dermatology meeting in Madrid, can walk the international stage and bring the sort of influence we need to the Child's Institute, and we've been very, very fortunate in having him guide that institute. So translational medicine, just to remind you what translational medicine is, it is the bench-to-bedside concept. It means that you have an institute like the Child's Institute, and you take the science from that institute and you take it as expeditiously as possible to the patient's bedside so that the patient can benefit from the research that is happening. And this was espoused indeed by Peter O'Flanagan in 2008 when he said, in the vital context of bench-to-bedside research and a successful collaboration between the researchers and the consultants in St. Vincent's University Hospital, and for the long-term good of patients, it is essential in our belief that this clinical faculty is world-class. Now, what he was referring to there was the fact that the patients in the old Hume Street Hospital had been transferred to St. Vincent's University Hospital. And he was referring to the fact that the charity was now going to endow that hospital so that there would be a centre worthy of the bench-to-bedside concept. And so we have now the Charles Centre in the Department the Department of Dermatology in St. Vincent's Hospital, and it has superb facilities for the modern treatment of skin disease. The Irish Skin Foundation was, if you like, the last of the trio that the charity had set itself ambition for. And what one was doing here was taking translational medicine a step further. So instead of going just from the bench to the bedside, the Irish Skin Foundation was founded with the purpose of bringing science a step further, bringing it out to society. And its vision, which is stated here, and its mission is to support all the people with skin disease in Ireland and to help them in whatever way one can. And it is seen that the Irish Skin Foundation will be linked very, very closely with the Child's Institute so that the research from the one can be brought by the other to society. It was complex enough setting up the Irish Skin Foundation, and again I acknowledge Nat O'Brien and Seamus Kennedy's role in this, because we had to bring together the Melanoma and Skin and Cancer Society, which had been established by Patrick Ormond. We had to bring the Psoriasis Association of Ireland, which Caroline Irvine had set up, and we had to bring the Irish Eczema Society, which Janet Brazel had established. And these were all brought together under the umbrella of the Irish Skin Foundation, so that the Irish Skin Foundation can represent all patients with all skin disease in Ireland. The inaugural board meeting took place in 2011, but since that meeting we have expanded the membership of the board appreciably. And so we have Fergus Slattery as our patron, and we have a number of members who are listed here representing business, representing dermatology, representing the legal profession, and of course the associations MASC, psoriasis and eczema that I mentioned earlier. And I just pay tribute to our patron Fergus Slattery, not for his rugby skills, but for his great ambassadorial skills and the importance he will be in bringing the message of sport and health to youth in the country. We will be doing a number of things in the Irish Skin Foundation. We will be providing information. We will be providing education and awareness. We will be providing community research. Scientific research will be done in the Charles Institute, but community research will be under the umbrella of the Irish Skin Foundation. And we will advocate for patients. I think very importantly, under the chairmanship of Alan Irvine, who apologises for not being here this evening because he also is in Amsterdam. I'm not sure what's going on in Amsterdam, but something's going on there. But he is chairman of the advisory board for the Irish Registry of Skin Diseases. And we're moving this forward quite rapidly, and I think it's going to be a major advance because we will obtain statistics on skin disease in Ireland, which we lack so much at present. I think we will also provide a model for other illnesses to develop registries. And if one takes a leaf out of the Swedish government's book, they are investing heavily in skin registries, because if you know what patients suffer from in the country, and particularly in different regions, you can apportion resources much more appropriately. And skin disease is very common. It is the fourth most common reason for visits to general practitioners. And 25 to 33% of the Irish population suffer from skin disease at any one time. And we may think that skin disease, and it's not as a motive of disease as, say, stroke, heart attack, or cancer, but it is a very common problem and a very disabling problem, as we've heard in previous lectures from many, many patients. And so to launch the Irish Skin Foundation to the public, we have had this 6-week series of lectures, of which this is the last one. And we are very grateful to the RHA for setting up Skin, an Artistic Atlas, which is a wonderful exhibition. I encourage you all to go and look at it before it closes at the end of the week. But I have to say also that as a foundation, we cannot survive without support, and by support I mean financial support. We have to make ourselves self-sufficient. The charity, in its benevolent way, is helping us for the first 2 to 3 years. And so we have reached out to industry, and I'm glad to say that we have brought in a number of foundation partners, and these foundation partners get nothing from us. All they do is give to us a substantial sum of money over 3 years so that we can become self-sufficient. And although we list these foundation partners, we have at least another 5 or 6 industries who are looking at the possibility of becoming foundation partners. And then finally, we need you, the public, to become a friend, to join the Irish Skin Foundation. You'll find ways of doing this in the brochure that's available, or you can do it on our website. It doesn't cost much, but it means a lot, and this will be our ongoing source of revenue in the years ahead. So, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I would just like to acknowledge the role of the City of Dublin Skin and Cancer Hospital in what the charity has achieved, to thank the charity for what it has done, to thank the various people here for all the ways that they have helped me to bring many of these aspects to a satisfactory conclusion. And I look forward to another century of real progress. Thank you.